Elon Musk was the one who kicked off this new push for the Trump administration to release the Epstein Files, after he was kicked out of the White House earlier this year. But he was a lot less eager to implicate the world's wealthiest, most powerful and well-connected people in their involvement with Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking ring when he was subpoenaed by the US Virgin Islands in 2023. I came across this as part of an investigation I've been working on into Jeffrey Epstein's finances, and any money trails that link him back to his clients. Even though he died 6 years ago, he left his estate with $600 million, and there's still money moving around that can provide not just clues, but actual receipts, bank statements, tax filings, lawsuit settlements, that all provide provable financial ties between Epstein and his wealthy clients. What I've found so far is over 30 court cases involving Epstein's sex trafficking operation that were quickly settled before they went to trial, and over $1.2 billion in lawsuit payouts from billionaires, major financial institutions, British royalty, and Epstein's estate. But because of purposely complex legal agreements made by expensive lawyers, the judicial system has been forced to trip over itself to protect those involved from any criminal consequences. And it's because of this that despite there being 200 known victims and more than $1 billion in payouts, there's been only one person criminally convicted, and no one has admitted any wrongdoing. For example, there was a plea deal struck between Epstein and Florida prosecutors in 2008 when he was convicted of sex crimes. The government gave him a non-prosecution agreement, which gave Epstein, his known co-conspirators, and any potential co-conspirators immunity from criminal prosecution. That's why there's been $1 billion in settlement payments, because the charges against anyone involved can't be criminal prosecution. It can only be civil lawsuits. Even government cases against Epstein and his co-conspirators have only been civil, which means big payouts, quiet resolutions, and consequences that amount to billionaires tossing pocket change to these abused women. And this immunity agreement wasn't a one-off thing. The US Senate Finance Committee is also investigating Epstein's finances, although they've been stalled indefinitely by the Trump administration, who revoked their access to tax filings and bank statements held by the IRS and US Treasury. I spoke with one of the investigators under the condition of anonymity, and he told me that even in the civil settlements, one of the stipulations the defendants attached to the payout is the promise of immunity from future prosecution, and not just for them, but for their lawyers and anyone that could have been implicated.
He reached a settlement with the US Virgin Islands, which is interesting for a few reasons. The settlement includes a line that says that part of the money, that the money that Black paid Epstein was used to fund Epstein's operations in the Virgin Islands. I mean, that's a pretty staggering admission for Leon Black to, sign his name onto. The other interesting thing about the settlement is that it also applied to all of his lawyers and agents. So none of them can be prosecuted either.
Oh, wow.
For anything related to the U.S. Virgin Islands. And why would his lawyers need immunity?
There's a lot to get into with Leon Black and the US Virgin Islands. They're the ones who subpoenaed Musk, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. Here are all the lawsuits that have been settled so far involving Epstein, billionaires like Musk and Trump, and, statistically speaking, probably your bank. It of course starts with Epstein and his estate, and how his method for avoiding consequences and keeping things under wraps has been a blueprint for everyone else. Though he dodged criminal consequences after his immunity deal, Epstein was involved in civil lawsuits filed by his victims for the rest of his life. Dozens of women sued him throughout the 2000s, which he quickly and quietly settled. And because he primarily groomed teenagers who were broke, desperate, and had little to no support system, he got them to settle for peanuts. A lot of the agreements are either sealed to protect the victim's identity, or as part of the agreement, he had his victims withdraw the suit altogether, so it's no longer in the system. But from the information that's available, Epstein's go-to settlement amount was only $150,000. And because he was rich, powerful, and literally immune from criminal consequences, what other option did they really have? Even Virginia Giuffre, who was groomed as a teen by Epstein while she was working at Trump's Mar-a-Lago, only received $500,000 when she sued him in 2009. Giuffre got a lot more when she sued Epstein accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell for defamation in 2015. The exact amount of that's never been disclosed, but it's been described as being somewhere in the millions. Giuffre was also later able to successfully sue Britain's Prince Andrew, who settled for $16 million. But in reality, many victims ended up dropping their lawsuits altogether because of harassment. The prime example of this was in 2016, when a woman sued Epstein and Trump for raping her in 1993 when she was 13 years old. Now, this may come as a shock, but some of Trump's most ardent supporters have a known history of harassing anyone who opposes him. And even though this woman filed her suit anonymously, she was still bullied, harassed, and threatened, to the point where she dropped the lawsuit the week before the 2016 election and has been silenced ever since. Then Epstein gets arrested in 2019, and more victims come forward and sue. Then he dies, and dozens more come forward and sue his estate, which, since he wasn't convicted, was able to retain Epstein's $600 million fortune. It paid out about $40 million in sexual abuse settlements here and there. But eventually, there were so many civil lawsuits that the Epstein estate was essentially able to reverse class action them away. In exchange for these victims' silence, the estate in 2020 agreed to create a victims' compensation fund, where anyone who claimed to have been abused as part of Epstein's sex trafficking operation could get a payout. But in exchange, they had to promise to never sue the estate again. And even though it created a literal restitution program for Epstein's victims, his estate admitted to no wrongdoing and avoided any criminal prosecution. In total, the compensation program paid out $120 million to 135 victims, and rejected the claims of 75 applicants. Then the program was closed, and the estate got a $111 million tax refund, basically canceling out the program's financial impact completely. Before the refund, though, all the costs associated with these constant legal battles drained the estate of $560 million, with twice as much going to lawyers than to victims. Now, unlike Epstein when he was alive, his estate didn't offer immunity to co-conspirators. And even though the compensation fund came with no admission of guilt, the fact that the estate settled meant the victims had compelling evidence, which in turn incentivized alleged co-conspirators to settle future lawsuits as well. And this is where the pile of money to protect Epstein's clients gets really big. And something important to keep in mind is even though the civil lawsuits have been settled, the financial documents that were used as evidence, wire transfers, bank statements, tax filings, are currently in the possession of the Trump administration, who has stalled indefinitely a 4-year congressional investigation into Epstein's finances, led by Oregon Senator Ron Wyden. The investigation could move forward by issuing subpoenas for these documents, and Wyden only needs one more committee member to sign off on issuing them. But for whatever reason, this has become a partisan issue, as every Democrat on the committee has agreed to issue subpoenas, and every Republican has declined. In 2020 is when the first financial regulatory action against Epstein took place. Deutsche Bank settled with the New York Department of Financial Services for $150 million for failing to report Epstein's suspicious transactions, despite labeling him internally as a high-risk client. This government case is really what opens the door to holding Epstein's clients and co-conspirators accountable from a financial angle, which is much easier to prove since there's a paper trail. The New York settlement gave the bank's shareholders grounds to file a lawsuit, which they did in 2022, the week after Deutsche Bank's settlement with New York was announced. The bank settled with its shareholders in May 2023 for $26.5 million over the bank's lax oversight while doing business with risky, ultra-rich clientele like Epstein. These finance-based court battles then gave Epstein's victims an avenue to pursue legal action in the same vein. Epstein's victims sued both Deutsche Bank and JPMorgan Chase in November 2022, using the same argument that the banks ignored suspicious activity from Epstein's accounts for years, but they never reported it because they were making money off it. Deutsche Bank settled with Epstein's victims for $75 million in May 2023, the same month it reached its settlement with the shareholders. And like Epstein's estate, they agreed to create a victims' compensation fund, where those trafficked by Epstein could receive a payout, anywhere from $75,000 to $5 million. JPMorgan settled the following month in order to avoid trial, paying 15 victims a total of $290 million. But unlike Epstein's estate, these settlements contain language that protects them from future liability and prevents states from suing on behalf of victims, shielding the banks from further consequences. But it didn't protect them from ongoing litigation. And this is where things take some even more unusual turns. A few months before Epstein's arrest in 2019, Denise George was appointed as the new Attorney General for the U.S. Virgin Islands, home to Epstein's infamous sex trafficking island. After his arrest, Attorney George began to investigate Epstein's money trail around the islands. In 2020, she filed a civil racketeering lawsuit against his estate, on the grounds that he lied to government officials in order to get tax breaks that he then used to help pay for his sex trafficking operation. And as she followed the money, it began to lead her to Epstein's clients, including Wall Street billionaire Leon Black. In November 2022, the same month the big bank settled with Epstein's victims, his estate settled with the Virgin Islands for $100 million, $80 million in unpaid taxes, and around $50 million from the sale of Epstein's island, Little St. James. And it probably goes without saying, but as part of the settlements, no one admitted to any wrongdoing. After this victory, George followed the money and sued JPMorgan. The bank immediately threatened to implicate Virgin Island officials they alleged were complicit in allowing Epstein's operation to continue. George was fired by the governor 4 days after the suit was filed. She had also began an investigation into Leon Black before being abruptly removed from office, who reached out to her replacement before any lawsuit was filed to reach a preemptive settlement to avoid going to court. Without any charges even being filed, Black agreed to pay the Virgin Islands $62.5 million and admitted he was aware he helped bankroll Epstein's island in exchange for immunity from future prosecution, both for himself and his legal team. This is another financial threat the Senate Finance Committee is trying to unravel. That Black lied about what he was paying Epstein for in his tax filings, thereby committing tax fraud. But to date, no audit has been conducted by the IRS. Not when the suspicious bank activity was reported and then fined, not when Black reached a multi-million preemptive settlement agreement with the Virgin Islands, and when Senator Wyden demanded information from the IRS about an audit, Trump fired the IRS chief. After the Virgin Island Attorney General was fired, JPMorgan said that they weren't going to settle. But then two things happened. First, the judge denied their request to throw out the part of the lawsuit that claimed the bank knowingly benefited from participating in a sex trafficking venture, and the allegation that they obstructed enforcement of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And second, the Virgin Islands was using this investigation to continue following the money, and started issuing subpoenas to billionaires connected with Epstein and JPMorgan, including Elon Musk. Musk denied any connection to Epstein, despite there being a well-documented, recorded history of his relationship with both Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. That and the Virgin Islands had found enough evidence to suggest financial ties to issue a subpoena of the richest man in the whole world, something that wouldn't be done flippantly. But despite Musk's very loud calls for transparency and demands that Trump release the Epstein files and hold those connected accountable, the guy who did none of that while he was working in the Trump administration went out of his way to not comply with the Virgin Islands investigation. Musk actively avoided being served with the subpoena for a month, and even after he was served, Musk never showed up. He pulled a Trump and stalled as long as he could, running out the clock until JPMorgan suddenly changed course and settled with the US Virgin Islands for $75 million, only a few months after they promised to defend themselves in court and clear their name. All of these settlements total out to around $1.2 billion. And until congressional investigators are allowed to access the IRS and Treasury, that's likely the only consequences that will come from Epstein's massive sex trafficking operation. Meanwhile, documentation outlining his financial ties to Musk, Black, Trump, Bill Clinton, you name it, remains untouched and unaudited, allowing the criminal element of this operation to be bought off for less than 1% of what these people are worth.